Oh. Sorry. Hi. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And honestly, you all are the real MVPs. When I think that you all are going to listen to me for approximately the same length of a Real Housewives episode on a holiday where you don't have to work, truly, it is a miracle. So thank you for this. I'm very excited to be here. Apologies in advance. I'm getting over strep throat. I'm no longer contagious. I'm taking my penicillin. So no worries if you talk to me afterwards, but it does mean that I'm gonna sound like this and occasionally maybe get lost because I'm still a little lightheaded. But again, it's really exciting to be here, and it feels really fitting to be here today on MLK Day talking to you all about sustainability and equity, because my experience of our built environment, and I say our because I do truly believe that, particularly in this country, we are knit together. This is our space, it's our environment. And so my experience of our environment was very shaped by who I was, and really who I am as a young Black woman. So that is a picture of baby me with my mom and my grandmother. It was, I think, my birthday. That was my first bike. It was a Barbie bike. I've always been a diva. And so I grew up on the south side of Chicago with my mom and my grandmother. I grew up in the same house that my mom grew up in, and a house that at this point my family has owned for almost 70 years. But the environment that I grew up in was different, really different from the environment that my mom grew up in. So when my mom would tell me stories about growing up in the same house on the same block, they were really vibrant stories that sounded a little bit like Leave It to Beaver meets Good Times. It was a lot, but it was just stories about a bustling like business strip that they all used to go to grocery shop and buy clothes, kids on the street riding their bikes all day playing together. I don't know if you can see, but in the background on the left, there's an abandoned lot, and she would tell stories about my uncles playing stickball and the time that my uncle really didn't want to lose, and so he gave all the kids chocolates that were really laxatives so that his team won. And that was her childhood. Even though, I mean, it was Chicago, so there was still segregation, right? There were streets that they could not cross. My uncle crossed the wrong street once and tells this story of how he rode his bike like he had never ridden his bike before because he was gonna get jumped. And that was the world that they lived in, and the world that I lived in felt completely opposite in a lot of ways. Segregation was over. I could cross any street that I wanted, in theory, around my neighborhood, but the truth was that by the time I was born in '89, drugs had already come in. The sort of where you could go was already patterned by where the gangs were. By the time I could like go to the park by myself, the park was a place for drug deals. So we couldn't go there anymore. And so my experience of my built environment was both one of growth, right? I could go anywhere, but in actuality, it was really bounded. It was really limited. And I still remember the 3 times when I got to ride a bike, not that bike, I had outgrown that bike by then, but I got to ride a bike with my cousins past the end of the block. I got to do that 3 times in my childhood. And that was just the way it was. I didn't really think about it a lot. until my family moved. When I was in college, they moved to a suburb, and I still remember that first summer when I came home from college. I was, at the new house, and I must have looked really crazy to the neighbors because I was 20, and I would just ride my bike around, sometimes in circles, like not going anywhere, because it was the first time in my life I had ever felt that kind of freedom. I didn't know, oh my gosh, I'm getting emotional. Sorry, guys, it's MLK Day, it's fine. But I had never felt that way before. I felt like I was flying, and I remember when I was writing this talk, how sad I felt for that little girl because she didn't get to do that. And that was the first time I think, understood what our built environment tells us, because it communicates. It tells us both what you're allowed and also what other people think about you. And I had grown up in a place that very clearly communicated to me and all the people that I live with that even though we loved each other fiercely, even though my neighbor picked up trash every day around because she really believed that seeing trash made you feel like trash, even with that, we were just surrounded by a lot of nothing, which made it seem like we were nothing. And that's really hard. And then moving somewhere and seeing that, like, that's not the normal. You can live in places, there are built environments that tell you, communicate that you are worth something, and that there's something out there for you, even if it's just a bike ride, just a breath of fresh air, that you deserve that. And so that's one of the reasons why I was really excited to come here, because it seems like you all are some of the people that are really on the cusp of thinking about the ways that our environment shapes us, the ways that it tells us who we are and what other people think we deserve. And the fact is that now, in the midst of a changing climate, our built environments do that and even more, because our built environment is in some ways actively killing us, and some of us quicker than others. And so this is H Street. How many of you have been to DC before? Oh, I forgot who I'm talking to. All of you. So this is H Street. Have you ever been to H Street Northeast? Okay, so yeah, so H Street is where I lived in DC for most of the time that I lived in DC. And when I used to see this picture before I worked on the Green New Deal, I just saw a street where I used to live, right? The first street near my first apartment, and the walk to the train station or whatever. But now, when I first started working on the Green New Deal, when I saw this photo, all I would think about was carbon, right? Those buildings, there's embodied carbon. We burn fossil fuels to power those buildings. Those cars burn fossil fuels. The streets made of concrete, all of it, right? All I would see is carbon. And then that was before sort of the next stage of thinking, because I'll be honest, when we first started the Green New Deal, we didn't think a ton about land use. We were thinking really strictly industrial policy. What are supply chains? What is decarbonization? All of that. And so sort of the next phase, because something I don't think a lot of people realize is that the Green New Deal it's a movement. It is sort of a living, breathing thing. And so there are phases. And so we quickly learned that we were short-sighted in not thinking about land use. And so then sort of in the second phase, when I would look at this, I would start thinking about design and land use. So is this part of an urban planning design that increases car use? Is it safe to bike or walk on the street? Are these bus lines, are these the green buses that the city has, right? Do they run these routes, or are these diesel buses that run these routes? Because this is close to a poor neighborhood. It used to be. Now if you go back, there's like a There's like 3 PetSmarts on the street or something. It's wild. So those were the things that I was thinking about. And the fact is that even that is too small. Even that is still thinking about this built environment in the midst of a vacuum, because the fact is that DC, like everywhere else, is in the middle of a really rapidly changing climate. And so, have you all heard of the 2100 project? Probably not, but it is essentially a gigantic mapping project. It's called the Atlas for the Green New Deal. It was put together by the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. I encourage you to look at it. It has really interesting visualizations of some really great data. And so this is their map of environmental risks. So these are the environmental risks that will face different areas of the country through the end of the century. And so you see there's like earthquakes, there's wildfires, there's floods, there's hurricanes. So all of that is happening in the midst of the environments that we have now. And so if you go, so this is their map of sea level rise. So DC is along those coasts, so the more intense the red, the higher the sea level rise, essentially. And I'd say I'm showing you all of this because now the questions about the built environment, we're not talking just about design or land use or even carbon. We are talking about a whole new constellation of questions, right? Because now, if I was to go back to that photo of H Street, now what I'm thinking about is H Street part of an urban heat island, right? As temperatures rise, will this area essentially cook its residents? And if we are trying to deal with all of that in the midst of, transportation and land use and design, what about the emissions from the buses? Are they contributing, but don't we need more public transit, right? How do we balance walkability and all these factors, reducing car usage with the fact that temperatures are rising, and will it be safe for people to be outside? Right? And so I bring all this up because these are the kinds of questions that I think you all face all the time. And these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask when we're talking about a built environment in general in the context of a G&D or not, but just a built environment in a changing climate. Like, these are the kind of multi-layered challenges that we have to face. And I say that because I feel like sometimes it's hard to grasp how many layers we're dealing with every time we're trying to solve a single problem. And I just think that even though it's hard, it's really important to just sit with that and recognize that, like, if you are in fact facing all of these layers of questions, you're not doing something wrong. Because I think sometimes the impetus is, if it's getting more complicated, you must just be complicating it. But the fact is, it's just complicated. Period. Which brings me to the slide about mortality. So this is climate change, mortality based on climate change projections. I think this is through 2099. I think the period that this captures might be 2080 to 2099. But the important part is to just look at the shape of what's happening. I'm sorry that the bottom is messed up, but essentially red means an increase in mortality. The more intense the red, the higher the increase in mortality. Blue is reductions in mortality. But I think it's really important to look at this in context with the next slide, which is national income distribution. So the places that are orange and the more are the places that are more impoverished, and the more intense the orange, the more impoverished they are. And I think it's just important to notice how the maps overlap. A lot of the places that are facing the highest sort of mortality risks are the same places where these are already some of the poorest parts of our country. And this is due in no small part, right? The link is due in no small part to the built environment, right? These are places that have decaying infrastructure, old dilapidated housing stock, high energy costs because of energy inefficiency. Their inability to bear the changes of climate have everything to do with the fact that they are poor. And the fact that they are poor has everything to do with the type of people who live there who often look like me. Right? And so I think that this is important because we've talked about layers, right? The layer of climate, the layer of design, the layer of decarbonization, but the layer of equity is never not there. This is the background to all of the policy that we create. It doesn't go away. There is no technocratic solution that will make this go away anytime within, before we do anything about it. And so I wanted to back up because I think this brings me back to one of the central questions of this conference, which, if I'm understanding it correctly, is about how equity and sustainability, equity in the built environment, how those are linked, and why equity has to be part of our response to the climate crisis. And I always like to tackle this head on because it's almost a year since the Green New Deal resolution came out, and people still ask me regularly, why does equity have to be part of this? Right? Why can't we just deal with climate? Why do you have to deal with income inequality and try to redress historical inequities? Why do we have to do all of this? And the fact is that it's because there's no such thing as just dealing with climate change. That doesn't exist. A colleague of mine, Jedediah Purdy, likes to talk about the society being a body, right? And energy, the energy we use right now, fossil fuels, that's the food that we take, right? Our built environment, in a lot of ways, it's our bones, right? And when we change our when we change our energy source, we change fundamentally the way that our body works and the ways that it has to work, right? It has to evolve. And so how many of you all have ever gone like vegetarian or paleo or vegan? I mean, it's January, so everybody, right? And how many of you, kept up with it for like longer than a month? I can't put my hand up because I never. And did your body change? Did you notice ways that your body changed? Whether it was having more energy or whatnot. And that's because your body had to change. You were giving it something different. And society isn't any different, right? When we change our energy source, we're going to change our body partially out of necessity. Because if you don't change when your source of fuel changes, you're inefficient, right? Like you're on your way to decay, because you cannot adapt to what is now the new normal. And I decided to come out here and talk to you all because, sneak attack, I don't usually do talks this long. I don't know why anyone wants to listen to another human being for an hour, just why? But I decided to do this because you all in this room sit at a really crucial intersection of these changes. You literally sit at the intersection between the change in our economy and the changes in our built environment. And those are really essential, because when we're talking about the change in our economy, it's really easy to think about it in very macro terms. But the fact is that, like, when I'm talking about a change in our economy, to me, I'm talking about the fact that renewable energy is going to fundamentally change a bunch of business models. Utility business models, right? Business models around just like operation of things. Renewables, the real cost is installation. It's not necessarily operating, right? You're talking about distributed energy. You're talking about going from a grid that is just a one-way flow to two-way flows, right? You're talking about fundamentally changing a lot of the fundamental business models in our economy. You're also talking about changing production centers, right? Because no longer do you have to be near fossil fuel rich places, right? Where you install things changes, right? It's about where is there a lot of capacity for solar or wind, or we've pretty much tapped out hydro, but possibly hydro, right? All of that changes, and that's going to change migration patterns, which also changes an economy. And then, of course, you have ideally really swift changes in demand where fossil fuels go from being the default to low carbon being the default. So all of these are, I think, really fertile changes that we still don't know exactly how they'll play out and exactly how they'll change things, but we do know that that's what's going to happen. And at the same time, you're talking about, along with these changes in the economy, really deep changes in our built environment, right? We need new infrastructure, new EV charging stations, new hydrogen fuel cell charging stations, solar arrays. You need new materials to build that infrastructure, new low carbon materials, new land use, new planning. All of this is happening, and they're really deeply intertwined. And so in some ways, I'm really jealous because I think you all have some of the coolest jobs going forward, because the way that we shape our built environment, not only does it have to support these changes, it can facilitate and accelerate them if we do them right. And so and I'm just talking about the changes that we have to make carbon-wise, but we saw the map of mortality and income and income distribution. So the fact is that we still have to decide what are the changes that we want to make. What is the kind of world that we actually want to build? Because there's what we have to do in order to deal with decarbonization, and people define that differently, right? And so it still remains that we have to decide what kind of world we want to build along with what has to happen. And we have to also define what has to happen, because that's not set in stone either. And so, so this is a map from that same atlas, and it's called The History of Big Ideas. And it maps some of the large-scale planning initiatives, all publicly funded, that the US has undertaken over our history. And I really like this map because I think in the midst of what is like very understandable overwhelm, it's really exciting to be able to see on a map that we have chosen the world that we want to build. There are times that we have done that very intentionally, and you can actually see that and visualize that on the map. And it's really, I think, as terrifying as it is, it's also exciting because we get to do that again in a way that I think is bigger than any of us imagine possibly in our lifetimes. And so when we are thinking about how to decarbonize, we also have choices in front of us. Like, America has less social infrastructure than we've ever had before, right? Fewer communal public spaces than we've ever had before. And we can rebuild that if we want. We can have things like community energy generation, green spaces, rec centers, local food systems. We can have those, right? And in a lot of ways, it makes sense to have those because they help us transition to a world without fossil fuels. But the question is, do we want to include them, and for who, right? Because the fact is, all of those things, as much as we need them and as much as they connect, we are still facing a political situation where unless you can say, hey, this is only about carbon, people will ask you why. Why do we need to do this extra stuff? And so I think it's really important to stop and recognize that we can have those things, even when people tell you that you can't. If you're gonna have to rebuild anyway, we get to choose. But the question still remains, what's the kind of world that we want to build? And again, because we never leave this background, the question is, who do we want to build those things for? Who do we want to get to use them? And so I I know I keep saying this, but I want to pause on this because in the work that I do, and I think the work that a lot of you do, it's really, and just living in the world that we live in this moment in world history and American history, it is really easy to see nothing in front of us but immense suffering and not a whole lot of ways out of it. I mean, Australia is still burning. There are bushfires now. I recently saw a video of a koala who was burnt and wailing, and I will never forget that. Right now, as we speak, there are armed men marching on Virginia's Capitol on MLK Day. Today. About gun control, but I think we all know it's not about gun control. You could have done that Tuesday if it was about gun control. But this is the world that we live in, and it feels like it's all so much often. But when I was writing this talk and thinking about the sort of things that you all get to think about and what we can design for our future, I just wanted to stop and recognize that, like, it's a really paltry miracle, right? It's a really tiny blessing, but what a blessing still, no matter how tiny, to be in a moment where we so clearly get to decide the kind of society we want to live in and carry into the future instead of feeling trapped in the society that we have. You don't get that all the time, you know? And, oh, thanks. It's very kind. But truly, you don't get that all the time, right? My great-grandmother was a washerwoman in Mississippi. She didn't get to choose the society she wanted to live in. She lived in the one she got. I get to stand at this podium and, low-key beg you all to build green, to consider equity as a 30-year-old Black woman. Miracles, as tiny as they are, do happen. And so I just wanted to pause on that because I think it is important to remember also that we are going to be someone's ancestor someday. So we truly need to take the ability, this moment seriously where we get to choose and really think deeply about what do we want to choose and what do we want to create for the people that come behind us. Because in some ways we really are immortal. Okay, that's enough Mariam Williamson for you. So back to economic transformation. So let's back up to the basics, which is what do we actually need to do to transform our economy? I'm going to say transform our economy approximately 35 times during this talk. And at some point, you'll probably be like, what does that even mean? And the fact is, it means a lot of things, but at its base level, it means that we have to do two things. We need to build and produce a lot more low-carbon stuff. We just don't have enough stuff. And then we also have to redesign our systems. In this talk, we're talking about the built environment, but of course, if you've followed the Green New Deal, we talk about having to change economic systems. We have to talk, something that we don't talk about a lot, but we need to talk about more is the fact that we have to change our political systems, all of these sorts of things. But the fact is we still do have to redesign our systems to support a fossil-free future. And so that's essentially what the G&D is trying to do. We're really aiming at two things, redesigning systems and building a lot of stuff. And it's really exciting because even though we've not done these things in this context, we have done these things before. So I don't know if you can see it, but on this map is the Tennessee Valley Authority. I'm going to show you my terrible grasp of geography right now. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was part of the New Deal, which was one of the biggest mobilizations where we tried to transform the economy in U.S. history. So this is the Norris Dam that was built in the New Deal as part of the TVA. And I like to talk about the New Deal for a couple of reasons. The first is that it was a response to both the Great Depression and, some people don't realize, the Dust Bowl. So much like we face today, which is an ecological and an economic crisis, the New Deal was a response to also an ecological crisis and an economic crisis. The other reason that I talk about it is, again, like today, I think you can think about the New Deal as a mobilization that had to be undertaken because one economic model, so the capitalism that came out of the Industrial Revolution, had reached excess. It had gotten out of control. And it had, in doing so, crashed the economy. And similar to what the Green New Deal is, which is partially a response to the excesses of neoliberal capitalism that have led to limitless extraction, right? To limitless burning of fossil fuels, to the things that have led us to the climate crisis. But I think it's important to realize that in the New Deal, I think the really important part for this talk is that the New Deal was not what we usually think of as an economic mobilization in the sense that it wasn't industrial. We didn't actually produce more stuff. Truly, the New Deal was an economic mobilization that tried to work through infrastructure and design. It was a large-scale infrastructure program. And so it does leave some lessons about what we have to do now, the ways that we have to think about rebuilding and redesigning our built environment, what we did before, how we did it before, the mechanisms that we use to do that. Now, if you're talking about an industrial economic mobilization, a mobilization where we truly stepped up our ability to create stuff, that is World War II. So this is a Chrysler factory in Detroit. I just moved to DC from Detroit, so what up, though? But this was a Chrysler factory that was converted to produce tanks. Because when the US got into World War II, we didn't have the capacity to build basically most of what we needed to build. So before entering the war in 1941, the US produced roughly 2,500 aircraft a year, 0.3 million tons of merchant ships, and less than 100 tanks. That was what we had the capacity to build. And by the end of the war, we produced approximately 550,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and at least 18 million tons of merchant ships. That was a 4-year mobilization. We built that kind of capacity in 4 years. And that was just like artillery and weaponry. We also learned how to make component materials, so basically invented and learned how to produce at a mass scale synthetic rubber. During World War II, we also increased the amount of magnesium and aluminum production anywhere from 7 times to 288 times the pre-war average. And the way that we did this, we did a lot of things. It was deeply a public-private partnership, but a big, really important part of it was public investment. So the US government spent $20 billion, and this is in 1945 dollars, about 10% of defense spending on facilities and machinery, literally just building the capacity to make stuff. And in fact, the federal government spent of all the money that was spent on this sort of stuff, they spent about 2/3. And so this is a table from one of my favorite books. If you want to learn about World War II history and making stuff, it's called Destructive Creation. But this is a table of the amount of public and private financing that went into the 25 largest plants that were operating during World War II. And if you'll notice, basically the public sector spent all the money. But in the end, this helped grow the economy in part because when the war was over, the government turned around and sold those facilities to private industry for pennies on the dollar, which, depending on who you ask, was a bad or a good decision, but either way, people benefited. And what's even more is that both, if you're talking about economic gains, both of these mobilizations help grow the economy, right? There's actually a really big question about whether we could have mobilized in World War II the way that we did if we hadn't done the infrastructure spending in the New Deal, right? If we hadn't expanded the amount of energy that was available throughout this country, if we could have done what we did. And beyond that, it was great for workers because when you have economic mobilizations, it tightens the labor market, right? It compresses the income distribution. So it actually reduces income inequality, it drives up wages, and it disproportionately benefits workers who are at the bottom of the income scale. So the New Deal produced about 15.5 million jobs. Over the course of the New Deal. And World War II at the peak, unemployment went from, I think, 13% before the war, and at its lowest, it was 0.4% during the mobilization. So if you're talking about how to jumpstart an economy, we kind of know how to do that in a lot of ways. But I think it's important to take a step back, considering that we're talking about equity today, because it's really easy to look at these examples and say, great, we did it, we just do this again. All we have to do is harness our ingenuity and have big ideas and do big things again, and that's true. But the fact is that both of these mobilizations failed a lot of people, right? World War II, the GI Bill, provided wonderful home loans. The rates were incredibly low. To veterans, 98% of those home loans went to white people. Those are the reasons that we have suburbia now, right? In some very real ways. And it's also part of the reason that we have the type of redlining that we have now. The New Deal created so many of the social structures, social policies that we still rely on, including Social Security. It was designed to exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers, the majority of whom were Black at the time, and it didn't include them for 15 years. That is 15 years of foregone wealth, right? And the thing that's important, I think, to remember about all that is that those legacies reverberate. That is 15 years that my grandmother, or great-grandmother, who was a washerwoman, could not save for retirement, right? My grandfather was a veteran in the Korean War. Same GI Bill, did not get a home loan. He thought it was because he was too prideful. My family always talks about he's too prideful to go ask for that sort of handout. It didn't matter if he would either way, because they wouldn't have given it to him, right? And to this day, my family and lots of families, millions of families across the nation deal with and live in the legacies of those decisions. And that's why it's really important to recognize that all of this mobilization, it happens in the context of the political economy, the society that we have now, and that is a political economy that's always been rife with inequity and fragmentation. And neither of these mobilizations attempted to change that political economy. In fact, particularly with the New Deal, the exploitation, right? Our political economy is built on the exploitation, economic, social, political, of certain groups of people, the desire to keep them and use the means of the state to keep them as cheap labor. And the New Deal did that. It upheld that political economy. World War II did it less so, but nevertheless did it. And so the fact is that no matter how strong these mobilizations were, there's always a weakness in the core of your society and in the core of your economy when some people the state is designed to keep them in a particular place. Right? And so it is imperative that as we go into this next economic mobilization that the Green New Deal is calling for, that we think about how we are engaging in our political economy, because equity does not happen by accident. If you put water down a hill that is sloped, the water will run down the hill. It will not distribute equally. And so we have to be honest that there is no sort of just dealing with climate change outside of our political economy, because if we truly want to bring about a more just and equitable society, then whatever we do in terms of how we are going to mobilize to address climate change has to face down our political economy and make some decisions about the kind of political economy that we want, because policy follows power. And the way that we distribute money, the way that we distribute power, and the transition away from fossil fuels will decide the political economy that we have when we get to our carbon-free world, right? And so if we have an economy that is as stratified as this, so this is just a graph from EPI. You've probably seen similar graphs about income inequality and the growth and whatnot. But essentially, if we have an economy that still looks like this, even if we have somehow decarbonized, which I don't know how we would do that at the same time, but say we did it, we still will have failed, I think, in some really fundamental ways. And so that just leaves us with the question of what do we do? How do we create a just and equitable green economy and a built environment that not only reflects that, but helps bring that justice about? And so I think it means that we have to grapple with a couple of facts. The first is that climate change and equity are linked, right? In very real ways. So studies continually find that countries with higher levels of income inequality, especially rich countries, have higher emissions, and that doesn't disappear just when you have something like density, right? Because a lot of people will talk about density as an answer to this, but a colleague of mine, Daniel Aldana Cohen, again at UPenn, he's done some research in New York and found that even in that city with its incredible density, a lot of the emissions are still driven by higher income people who have a much larger carbon footprint. And we're not sure of the mechanisms, but we do know that there's something there. We do know that somehow inequality is helping to drive up emissions. And even if the exact mechanisms aren't clear, what we do know is that fossil fuel industries depend on the existence of disposable communities to exist. Because when you burn fossil fuels, you essentially poison people, which means that you have to have a place where you can poison people, and their response, their outcry, can be ignored in lots of ways. That is a fundamental part of a fossil fuel business model. And so as long as there is inequity, there's always a chance for that to happen. And the other thing I think we have to grapple with is that incremental solutions aren't going to cut it. And that's really difficult, I think, in this moment to grasp, because the state of, I think, being a human a lot is that inaction leads to more of the same. If you don't do anything, everything stays the same, right? But we're in a moment where inaction actually leads to like a deep and really rapid unraveling of the world around us, especially for our economy. And so this is another map from the Atlas. I just love the Atlas. And it's total economic effects based on climate change projections. And the sort of darker that brown color is, the more loss there is. And so by 2099, 76% of counties in the US will experience economic damage because of climate change, right? And even if you look at the maps of shore level rise or environmental risk or mortality, what you actually see, which I think is the most frightening part of these maps, is that whole parts of the country become kind of unlivable, right? You lose a lot of your coasts. A lot of the southernmost states will be so hot, right? That workers who work outside in places like Texas will be in deep danger. And so we're talking about not just sort of economic loss in terms of dollars, but the amount of productive, in a lot of ways, productive land shrinking, right? So that we go from this large country to essentially having to live huddled in only parts of our nation. And so I think it's just important to recognize, because this is what happens if we don't do anything, right? It's not more of the same, it's worse. And similarly, if you look at, these are the temperature increases, right? And so by 2099, near where I live in Maryland, it'll have the temperature of Mississippi. Our infrastructure, our built environment is not prepared to deal with these changes. When I think about Detroit, Detroit's median income is about $23,000. It is one of the poorest cities in the nation. Detroit is going to get hotter, and even when it gets hot in the summer now, it's a problem. But people can't afford air conditioners, and there aren't cooling centers. What happens? Right? What happens? And all of this is without considering that we have a population boom on the way. So by 2060, the US population is projected to grow approximately 100 million people, similar to the baby boom, right? And so these are some of the slides, again, from the Atlas about what's necessary. And this is just what's necessary to sustain the next 100 million people. So we're talking about like billions of solar panels. We're talking about almost 200,000 billion gallons of irrigated water. We're talking about an incredible amount of storage capacity that's needed. And this is without, that population booms without factoring in climate refugees, right? So this is what we're facing, and also because it's MLK Day, and I can't go without talking about white supremacy, we also have these dudes controlling the response, right? And so it feels like a huge mess, a really staggering mess. But again, going back to what I was talking about, I think the wildest part of all this is that with all of this going on and all that we're facing, the question isn't, can we get out of this mess? It's how will we get out of this mess? And I'm not just saying that because we have to, because apocalypse. I'm also saying it because if we were only able to get into this situation because we were smart enough to create these problems, or dumb enough, depending on how you think about it. But the fact is, we created corporations, right? We created these systems. There is nothing that is causing these problems that we haven't designed, which means that we have the capacity to redesign it. Truly. And I like to linger on that because, especially, it's MLK Day, we're thinking about how he fought for a better country, but I'm often shocked by how many people will come up to me and just be like, we'll never get climate action because of Mitch McConnell. And I'm like, you would rather face down Mother Nature, who is 5-0 in the extinction game, by the way, she has never lost, and versus the filibuster? That's the enemy that you want to choose? And it's always really wild to me because part of what feels like happened over since the Reagan era, maybe longer, is that we have there's so little faith in what we can do. I'm just amazed that today we can think about MLK and all of his struggle, or we can talk about how the founding fathers did what they did, and we act as though we can't design anything. If they could do that, why can't we do that? And I will just put a pin in this, all of us are a little bit smarter than Thomas Jefferson, because do you believe in slavery? No? Great, you're a little bit smarter. So you're much better equipped. And so this is, even though it's a mess, the fact is that we can do these things. So much is possible if we do the work that is necessary. And so what is the work that's necessary? So this is the place where I'm going to start talking about policy specifics and sound very smart. I know this is the part that you've been waiting for, so you're welcome. So HR 109, how many people have read, it's often called the Green New Deal resolution, The official name is House Resolution 109. How many people have read the Green New Deal resolution? Okay, I'd encourage you to read it. It's 14 pages. The font is really big and there's a lot of spacing, so it's truly not even 14 pages. But it includes 6 goals related to the built environment and transportation. So it's building resiliency against climate change related disasters, largely by leveraging funding and providing investment for community-defined projects, upgrading and repairing infrastructure, meeting 100% of the power demand in the US through clean and renewable sources, upgrading all existing buildings in the United States, and building new buildings to achieve maximum energy efficiency, water efficiency, safety, it goes on, overhauling transportation systems in the US to remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, from the transportation sector, and cleaning up hazardous waste and abandoned sites. So I often just like to think about it as resiliency, infrastructure, transportation, so on. And these are the things that the resolution says. Of course, if you read the resolution, it doesn't say how we will do these things, because the truth is when that resolution went out, when we started developing the Green New Deal, and even now, we don't know how we'll do these things. And I don't say that to be flippant, it's because no one knows. We don't know. And I like to emphasize that because I so often I'll see papers that'll sort of not say here's 5 things we can do, but they sound very assured of themselves. But the fact is that no one has faced a challenge on this scale before. We really haven't. In quite the same way. And we can talk about models and projections, but none of those represent reality accurately. There is an element of this where we simply don't know the world that's coming, so we don't know exactly what we need to do. But when we released the G&D and when we started working on it, we took a bet that even if we didn't know, even if no single person knew, that together, if we came together, we could figure it out. Because enough people know enough stuff, right? That if we can work together, we can figure out how to do this. In part because, like I said, we're building a world. This isn't a test. There's no one correct answer. There's lots of paths that we can go down that will lead us to the place that we want to go. And so that is what is happening in the G&D now. That's the phase of the G&D that we are in right now and have been in. I would say probably, in some sense for the last year, but really intensely, I think over the last 6 months. And what we do know, even if we don't know exactly how it will go down, we know that it's going to require research, it's going to require regulation, market development, financing and investment, and new programs and services. And all of these things actually need to align and coordinate, which is why you want a mobilization often, because it allows a greater amount of alignment and coordination than is what's allowed in other sort of responses. And so in terms of research, so like a couple of things. So one of the first things that I truly believe we need is a taxonomy of buildings. We are talking about upgrading all homes and buildings in the US. We have something like 180 million homes in the US. They vary widely in how they're designed. They vary by region. And we don't have any of that data centrally. So it's very difficult to plan how you will actually upgrade all these homes, how you might be able to do it in the most efficient ways, unless we have a taxonomy, unless we actually take some time and figure out what do the buildings look like, what do we actually need to do, and how do we update them on a mass scale. And of course, for transportation, we're also talking about transit systems for different types of areas, right? There's the public transit options that you need for a rural area are different than an urban area, right? The ways that you support accessible transit can be very different, and we actually need to do some real thinking about not only what are the sort of different transit systems that we need, and some people have started doing that thinking, but it's hard to find still, and also ways to plan, just like we kicked off suburbanization in the post-war era, I think it's time to think about what are the new ways that we want to plan communities to reduce energy expenditure, to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. Because I don't always know if we can do that right now, because people are not super jazzed about being like, we're gonna redesign your home, the one you live in right now, your whole neighborhood right now. But that doesn't mean that we can't start to make changes and plan for the future. In terms of regulation, I mean, there's so many things that you can do. One of the first things, I remember talking to an Obama alum who had helped write the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and we were like, how do we get people to do what we want to do? Like, is it tax incentives? Is it, you know, do we nudge people? He was like, just tell them what they can and cannot do. We try, you know, because he was like, we don't have time for incentives. We tried that, and I think there are places for incentives, but there are places for a kind of regulation that we haven't been comfortable with for a long time, which is, you know, regulation. There's questions about, should we just outright phase out internal combustion engine vehicles by a particular date, right? Instead of all of these, you can build this until this part of the market share, maybe you just say by 2040, we don't use those anymore. Done. Right? There's other regulations. Building codes are largely local, but do we want to issue federal guidance and targets to support state and local policies requiring new construction to be zero carbon, right? Increasing the air quality, indoor air quality that is reasonable so that we can help kick out natural gas out of homes, right? There's legislation like NYC's climate mobilization plan that already requires all new buildings to be built with either green roofs or solar arrays, right? So regulations are happening. The question is, how do we want to use them? Excuse me, do we want to set emission standards for existing buildings? Do we want to halt new gas infrastructure build out? So a regulation can do a lot. Regulation is about, you can both nudge, but it's really about setting up the guardrail, saying what is possible and what isn't, so that we can have clear markers for what is another part of this, which is market development, right? And so market development, some of the things that we think about a lot is, what's the role of federal procurement, right? The federal government builds and buys a lot of stuff, right? And so how do you use federal procurement to increase demand and to stabilize markets for low carbon goods, especially ones that are nascent, like cross-laminated timber or prefabricated retrofits, or even just solar panels, right? And also market development, how do we tie building codes so that key trigger events, like when a building is bought or renovated or replaced, it triggers basically things that you have to do in order to upgrade that building, right? Is that one way that we can get all buildings upgraded? Financing and investment, you're talking about things like a climate bank, right, that provides access to capital for building upgrades, for deployment and implementation. You're talking about direct public investment a la World War II in nascent industries. You're talking about using ARPA-E to fund research into clean fuels and electrification for heavy-duty transit. Those are all things that we can do. And of course, new programs and services you're talking about, are we going to upgrade homes and buildings through a federal program or a partnership with states? Are we going to have new grant programs to replace the low or no emission vehicle program? Are we going to have new on-bill financing so that people can install solar into their homes? All of those things are all in play, and there are solutions out there that I haven't mentioned and solutions that we haven't come up with yet. And all of those are necessary for us to do the things we need to do to transform our economy and our built environment. And so what I'll leave you with last is that it's important not just to ask what we will do, but how we will do it. Because again, equity is just as much a matter of what we do as how we do it. Who gets these jobs? How much do they pay? What's the quality of these jobs? do people have access to the qualifications that they need? So all of these have to be supported by just and equitable social programs, systems, and workforce development to make these things the ways that they need to do. And we also need to talk about new models of ownership, particularly community ownership and local ownership. And so I'm gonna leave you with this quote, because it was MLK Day, so I can't, I mean, if BP gets to quote Martin Luther King, I do. And the quote is simple. Capitalism forgets that life is social, and the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. Because ultimately, this is what the Green New Deal is about. It's not about a far left response. It's really, truly not even about our politics. It's about people. It's about recognizing that contrary to what we've been told, our actions are not just the result of ourselves, right? Our environments do shape us, our settings do shape us, and policy has a big role in shaping the settings that we all grow up in. And we're heading into an increasingly, even under the best estimates, we're heading into an increasingly resource-constrained society, or into an increasingly resource-constrained world, in a society that is soaked constantly in scarcity. We have to get everything that we want off the market, right? It is us, it is you alone out there, but in a place where actual things will actually become more scarce. We need a setting that gives us the space to be generous and kind and empathetic, because that's what we're gonna need to get through this transition, and that's what we're gonna need to face an uncertain world without devolving into, I think, the kind of chaos that is just knocking outside of our door always these days. And the Green New Deal is fundamentally about creating that world, about creating a set of background conditions that actually allow us to live as the best of ourselves and show that to other people in ways that I think we are not able to now. And you all are really crucial to that, and so I hope that you will help us figure out how we do this and how we actually create a future that MLK would be proud of, but more importantly, that you are proud of. So thank you.